Okay, recording in progress. Good morning. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. Thank you everybody for coming. We are making our way through the halachot of Lash. We began last week. Just a reminder again, a housekeeping announcement. There will be no share next week. Next week I'll be away because Rat Hashem will be back the week after, so we will resume normal service. So no share for next week, but we will be back after that. Okay. So we started talking last week about Lash. I'm not going to repeat everything that we said. We spoke primarily about the principles. We tried to define the melachah of Lash, of kneading, which is generally the English translation, which is somewhat inadequate. We discussed how there are two stages to the melachah of Lash. Essentially, whereas the previous melachah we had discussed was tochen, which is grinding or crushing or taking one object and dividing it into many smaller pieces, Lash is essentially taking two substances and mixing them together to form one unit. The classic example of that is when I take flour and water and then I knead it together and I have dough, which is a new entity where the water and the flour come together. Okay, we saw that there are two distinct stages in that process. One is in terms of adding the water to the flour and then kneading the water and the flour together. So clearly, kneading the water and the flour together would constitute the melachah, with adding the water as well. So we discussed that. We saw different opinions. We generally try and be stringent for that. That's certainly when it comes to adding water to flour. What about when it's adding water to other substances which may not coalesce so easily or may not need kneading as much? So we discussed that. We saw, one thing I will just repeat, is we saw a great distinction between thin and thick mixtures. It was called blila raka and blila ava. So certainly the easy way to remember it, to think about it, if we think about dough, right, flour and water, which is a thick mixture, that is essentially the prototype of the melachah that we are discussing. We have a thick mixture that would consider kneading. If you have a thin mixture, almost like a liquid sort of mixture, that would not really be considered kneading to the same degree. Probably not an isur d'oraita, probably still be an isur d'rabanan. And therefore we discussed, the Gemara said that if we're dealing with a thin mixture to begin with, and then you have a shinoi, so then it would be allowed. What is considered a shinoi? So we saw we're discussing in terms of adding the water to the substance, so you would add it the other way around. You would put the powder in first and then the water, if you normally put in the water and then the powder, or vice versa. That would constitute the shinoi, and then there would be a shinoi in terms of the way that you mix. Rather than using a spoon or whatever, you would use your finger, or you would mix rather than mixing it all together. You would kind of do strokes in different directions, and that would be considered a shinoi. Okay, those are the basic principles we discussed last week. If you weren't here, I apologize. You won't find the recording online because the computer went missing. Thankfully, the computer has been unmissing. So we have it now. We're back on Zoom, and we have a recording today. So let's pick up on page 137. 137 for those who have the books. We now get into the practical examples. You can see the Tzurba Rabbanan, is very nicely color-coded. So the section that we will be discussing today, just about all of the sources are in purple. Purple is contemporary poskim. We've gone through the Gemara, the Rishonim, the Achronim. Now we're in the contemporary sources, looking at the applications, looking at the practical questions of Lash. Everybody wants to know. I know you haven't been able to sleep for the last week, wondering whether you can make mayonnaise on Shabbat. So here we go. Okay. Very good. Okay, so we're on page 137. We're looking at the practical examples of Lash. So first here we see, in terms of making mayonnaise on Shabbat. Why would you make mayonnaise on Shabbat? Because you don't want to buy in the store mayonnaise, but whatever it is. So can you do that on Shabbat, or do you have to do it beforehand? So says the Shema Shabbat Kilchata, source number 39, B'Shabbat, asur lachin mayonnaise samich. Okay, again, if we're dealing with, remember, we're dealing with a thick mixture, so that would be more problematic. So you cannot make a thick mayonnaise on Shabbat. If it is a bit more liquidy, so he says, he says it's better to make it before Shabbat. In other words, not necessarily going to be prohibited, okay, but it's better to do it before. Rav Avadia over here is a little bit more lenient even than that. He says here in Chazon Avadia, he says, Mutar la'asot mayonnaise b'Shabbat. He says this is allowed. How do we make mayonnaise? Essentially, you're taking eggs, oil, mustard, sugar, and a bit of salt. Anybody didn't know how to make mayonnaise, so you have a nice recipe from Rabbi. Okay, he doesn't give us the quantities though. That's going to be the key. But in any event, he says you could do that. So long as the intent is to eat it now at the next meals for immediate use. Also not to beat it too forcefully. Rather, you should mix it gently with the spoon. Okay, so he does not require, whereas the Shmat Shabbat Kil may require a greater shinoi than that. But he says, so long as you aren't mixing forcefully, that would be permitted, again, to make a sort of thinner mixture. Now, the next case that comes up is regarding baby food. So often, one wants to add certain maybe different solids and mush them up together in a liquid. Would that be allowed? So here we see the Rochot Shabbat quotes from the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish actually has quite a leniency over here. Again, when we're dealing with preparing something for a baby, so this is it's going to come up not just by this melachah, but by many melachot. So again, if it's forbidden, and if it's an Isur D'Oraita, there's a melachah is a melachah, you can't do it. But when we're dealing with Isur D'Rabanan, and we're dealing with shinoi, and dealing with different things, so if we are preparing for a choleh, or we're preparing for a baby needs food, and it's going to be quite a serious thing. They don't have food to eat, so then we're generally going to be more lenient where we can. So it says the Rochot Shabbat here over the page, this is now source number 41, top of page 138, it says, כתב החזון איש, שלצורך הכנת מאכלים לתינוק, אפשר להקל פשיטת רוב הפוסקים, הסוברים שאין איסור תורה בנתינת מים לקמח. Remember, this is what we started off. We said, again, mixing the two substances together, that is certainly going to be the melachah of Lash. Just adding the water, is that going to be the melachah? We saw that's a machloket in the Gemara, we saw a machloket Rishonim, we saw machloket Achronim, we saw machloket how to understand the Shulchan Aruch, right? But we generally try and be machmir in terms of that. Says the Chazon Ish, if we're dealing with preparing baby food, yeah, you can be maker. Yeah, you can rely on that opinion. And he says, therefore, lachin mutar lachin avur machalim af b'bli la'ava al yedei she'aseh shinoi begibur. Okay, he says you should still do a shinoi when you are mixing together, but even if we're dealing with a thick mixture for a baby, this would be permitted. Practical examples. לכן הבא לערב מיץ בבננה מרוסקת או בתפוח מרוסק, you have crushed up apple or banana, you want to add juice to it, okay, לצורך תינוק, הרי זה מותר. For the sake of a baby, that would be permitted. ובלבד שישנה בגיבור. The way that you are mixing, you should do with a שינוי, כגון שיערב שתי וערב, או יערב באצבע, right, as we discussed, different ways of mixing, not the usual manner. ואם הערב בתערובת זו גם פירורי ביסקוויט, או עוגה, if you're adding in as well different crushed up biscuits or cake or something like that, כתב החזון איש יעשה את השני בגיבור דווקא על ידי גיבור שתי וערב ולא על ידי גיבור באצבע. In such a case, the shinoi has to be that you are mixing it from side to side, has to be a complete shinoi in the way that you mix. נרד הוא הדין אם נותן בתערובת גבינה, יעשה את השינוי על ידי שתי וערב. Okay. So all that is for a thin mixture. Right, if we're dealing with that is for a thick mixture where there certainly needs to be a shinoi in the way that you mix it together. If we're dealing with a thin mixture, just changing the order, that would be enough. Okay, what about preparing powder, materna or whatever, milk powder, where you just add the formula to the water? Is that a problem? So it says, no, that is not a problem. Again, go back to our definitions. Lash, we said we are taking usually water, usually a solid and a liquid, and I'm mixing the two items together and coalesces to form one thing. Again, all the time, the easy way to remember, we go back to our flour and our water, which makes dough. So here we have our milk powder and our water. We're mixing them together. Is that considered lash? Is that a prohibition? So he says, no, we don't have to be concerned. Over here says the Shmat Shabbat, Haba la'achin chalav, me'avkat chalav regila, me'avkat chalav miuched letinokot. You have milk powder formula, right, which you add to water. כגון אבקת מטרנה, מכיוון שאבקות אלו נמסות במים והתערובת נוזלית, here what happens, the powder is going to dissolve immediately into the water. We're dealing with it remains liquid. There is never a solid substance that is formed, and therefore מותר לעשותה כמו שרגיל במות החול, בכפוף לדיני בישול. You can do it the way that you would normally do it. Obviously, whenever we're talking about powders and dissolving, we have to be aware of ilchot bishul. But we have to go step by step. If it's hot water, kli rishon, kli sheni, etc. But in terms of lash, that is not a problem. That doesn't come up. There are those who say that you should make sure you add a lot of water immediately so that no solid mixture before is formed at all. Okay, so have a look at number 44 on the next page. This is from the grey book, right, of Rabbi, 39 melachas. Based on the principle of the Dvar says it's perfectly permissible to mix cocoa with milk or drink powders into water because the result in all of these cases is a thin liquid which does not resemble any lash mixture. Similarly, it's permitted to make coffee or tea as long as one avoids the melachah of bishul. Right, that's just a little footnote there. As long as you avoid melachah of bishul, we had entire shiurim about how to make coffee and tea, etc. But in terms of this, it's not an issue. Yeah.
None of these things are a problem.
No, there's no lash is completely permitted on Yom Tov. Yeah. Lash, bishul, adam melachot are but from the Yerushalmi says that all the things from lash and onwards are all that's considered ochel nefesh. That's in the kitchen and that's permitted. Yeah. Okay. Another question that comes up is about preparing tzchina on Shabbos. So have a look here. So let's just read through the box. He says here the melachah of lash involves binding substances together using liquid, as we've discussed. Many people in Israel prepare tzchina. You could do it in Chutz La'aretz as well, but I guess it's not so common. But maybe nowadays it is a bit more common. But many people prepare tzchina, a paste made from sesame seeds, also known in English as tahini, by adding water to the liquid paste to make it ready to eat. So you have the tzchina paste. You're going to add water. Okay, and essentially you are taking a thicker paste and you're making it thinner. So again, that seems to be the opposite of lash. That does not seem to be a problem at all. However, sometimes when you add, it gets a little bit thicker first, and then you add more liquid, and then it becomes thinner. So therefore, says the Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, he says, "En aktsif b'Shabbat china gormit, v'hu ma'achal dalil shel kitniot, she'al yedei shemavim bo mayim, o she'amoshkin o bochashim otam naseh aveh ke'isat halechem." So he says, when you add the water first, it makes a sort of a thicker paste, and then afterwards you mix it together, and then it becomes thinner. So he says you have to be careful of doing that. However, it says "Ulam b'shatat tzorech, im yishpoch mitchila et kol hamashkin b'ofen shelo tidaveh bichlal bli lava." If you pour in all the liquid in one go, so it becomes thin right from the beginning, then that would be permitted. He says over the page, "Aval im kvar yachin mibod yom tchina." If you'd prepared it and you'd added the water already on Erev Shabbat, viraka, and it's now soft, it's liquid, mutar, and you want it to be a little bit thinner, nonetheless, then you could add water, and that would be completely permitted. Okay, others are not as stringent. Wait, the Pinelach was in here somewhere, or maybe he was talking about what I saw. Maybe he was talking about something else. Yeah, he says over here. Oh, we've got it from the Or Tzion. Source number 47, he says, if you take granules, cause them to stick together, like when you place flour and water. Since it's liquid already, he says, you're not causing anything to stick together. He says, therefore, there is no problem there. The Pnina Lachas is the same thing, is referenced here on the footnote. Okay, so there is a bit of a difference of opinion regarding making tzchina on Shabbat, but the general principle is if it's already liquid and you're making it thinner, that's not going to be an issue. Okay. Now the question that comes up, a lot of these questions can come up. Sometimes a person finds themselves, maybe in the army, but a person might find themselves for Shabbat in a hotel room somewhere on the Asian continent, and they don't have any have any kosher food or any hot food or whatever. So maybe you have you have a manach hamau, you have an instant pudding or an instant mashed potatoes or whatever. Right? These are the situations. Can you prepare those things? Could you make that food on Shabbat? So we've already spoken about bishul. We know that bishul is forbidden on Shabbat. You cannot cook. Right, klisheni, klishlishi, we've had all those discussions. This is going on top of that. The next stage is, if I've sufficiently avoided the prohibition of bishul, right, to have an issue of lash. So, Igor Moshe Feinstein has a discussion here, source number 48, says, right, what's known in Hebrew as instant potato. Right, you see there in the bracket. Or pudding, me'avkan mesa, which is known in Hebrew as instant pudding, right? Okay. are you allowed to prepare that? They we spoke before that, okay, so you do a shinoi, you place the water first or the water last, whatever. So he says, right, with mashed potatoes, right? It's it's going to be a thick mixture, puree, and therefore he says that is forbidden. Pudding, the pudding, if it's very liquidy, so then so long as you have the shinoi that's required, but if it's a thick mixture, that is still going to be forbidden. Okay, that is a distinction that we've already seen. Now, Rav Rimon in his Sefer Nechot Shabbat, he says maybe, he follows Rav Moshe, but he says maybe we can be even a bit more lenient. He says like this, Lidvarav, Nitan nachin pudding b'Shabbat, aval bishu notzar me'atzmo m'netinat hamayim. Right, once you add the water, that already starts to form, the substance starts to form the pudding. Therefore, now if it's a thin mixture, so Moshe Feinstein said that was allowed. So bitnai she'aseh pudding nozlim od kach shechashev bli lalaka. So long as it's the thin mixture. V'shaneh b'sen netinat hachomarim, v'motzei la'arbev yarbev v'shinoi. You need a shinoi both in the order that you place the ingredients and in the way that you stir. Now, mitzad sheni, when it comes to making this mixture of mashed potatoes that he says is forbidden, right? You don't need to mix it; it already starts to become substance starts to come together. And this is a thick mixture. This is what we started off with, right? With water and flour already. According to many opinions, just adding the water is a prohibition. So too, just adding the water, already it's going to be a thick mixture. The fact that I'm afterwards doing a shinoi in the way that I mix it, it's too late. So he says, that which we said, that you can change the order of adding the ingredients, we didn't say that by water and flour, for instance, right? We said that where it's going to be a thin mixture, not a thick mixture. So what is there any way around this? So over the page he says, you could not prepare it before Shabbat. You're in a place, right? This would never happen here, but you're in a place where there are no meals for Shabbat or something, a hotel somewhere or something, I don't know, and you want to prepare it. This is maybe there is a solution. If you add a lot of water, you add a large amount of water, not sure how tasty it's going to be after that, but then it's going to be, right, it's going to be liquidy, it's not going to be a thick mixture, and then we can say that you add the water first, and then afterwards the powder, and if you want to mix it, you do it with a shinoi. Okay, but that's the general principle that we've already seen. Now the Shmat Shabbat Kilchata goes one step further. He says even a thin mixture, right, for instant powder, he says no. He says kol avkot avchot letavshil raoi lachila l'day osafat mashkin alehem v'tavshil ze eino nazil ki mutzak. All the different types of mixtures that are not going to be solid, liquid, but are going to be solid, right? So avkot pudding, jelly, or shvavei tpuchei adama, asur lishpoch alehem nozlim. וכן אסור לתיתן לתוך נוזלים, מכיוון שיש בכך משום איסור לישייס. All of this is prohibited, ואסור לעשות כן גם אם אינו עושה על ידי זה רק בלי רכה. That's his chidush, that he says that even if it's a thin mixture, it's going to be forbidden. Why would he say that? So seemingly, he is more machmer over here because when we're dealing with certain powders and things, the moment that I add the water, already it mixes together and it starts to coalesce without ever having to mix it. That would seem to be very similar to water and flour. That's going to be forbidden, maybe even on a d'oraita level. That's based on the Shulchan Aruch in source number 51. So to summarize, basically, what we're talking about is you have instant powders, instant puddings, instant mashed potato, right? Everything today is instant. So right? So we saw the first question is, are we dealing with a thin mixture or a thick mixture? If it's a thick mixture, absolutely forbidden. That's according to everybody. That's what Moshe Feinstein says as well. If we're dealing with a thin mixture, so as we've seen, if I change the order and I do it with a shinoi, that would be permitted. The Shemirat Shabbat Kilchata is a little bit more machmir. Okay. Kedai Rav Moshe Feinstein is mochel. One wants to rely here on Rav Moshe Feinstein's opinion. That's fine. But the Shemirat Shabbat says, he says that no, the whole discussion we said with a thin mixture, that's only where it's going to require some sort of mixing together with these instant puddings and the like. Even if it's thin, the fact is that you add it and straight away it starts to coalesce. Therefore, he says that would be forbidden. But as we said, Rav Moshe Feinstein allows it. What about making what some people in this room will call jelly and some people in this room will call jello, right? So that is also, you have powder and you add the water, so what happens with this is that it becomes, the initial mixture is liquid, and afterwards you leave it to set, and then it's going to become solid a little bit later. So Rav Yosef, he compares this to making ice. He says like this in Chazon Ovadia, see page 143. It says achanat jelly bazak b'Shabbat. Jelly achshav, right? So he says making instant jelly powder, jello, whatever you want to call it. I have to share with you an anecdote which I've probably shared in the past. But in South Africa, like in England, we call this jelly. What you in America call jello, and what you call jelly, we call jam. So, and you know, it's in all the cartoons and in all the books and all the movies, whatever, that, you know, the classic peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So when I was growing up, I could never understand why you would have a sandwich with your, you know, jelly, that jello, whatever, inside. Never understood how that worked until one day I discovered that we speak different languages, and peanut butter and jelly is actually a peanut butter and jam sandwich. Okay, that makes more sense. In any event, so he says, "Yachanat jelly bazak b'Shabbat, often shemalvim avka b'mayim chamim b'kli sheni." Again, this entire discussion is predicated on the fact that we have gotten around, we've circumvented the problem of bishul. Okay, so he says you've got your powder that's added into the hot water and kli sheni, and I'm not now getting into the discussion again if it has to be kli sheni or kli shlishi. We've discussed that in the past. After you've mixed it and you've stirred it and everything, then it dissolves in the water. The water becomes like this, right? It takes on the color. There's a separate question we'll discuss later on, the melachah of tzurba. Is that going to be a concern? Right, we'll get to that. But and then afterwards it becomes like a sort of thick soup, and then you leave it in the fridge, and then the whole thing hardens and congeals. Can you do all this on Shabbat? So says Rav Ovadia, he says you're concerned about lisha, about kneading the substances together. You don't have to be concerned in this case. Since it stays as a liquid substance, even though then it becomes a little bit thicker, you created a liquid mixture. Afterwards, by itself, it became solid. Okay. Okay, again, that is not so. This is Rav Ovadia, according to the Sfardi Psika, according to Ashkenazim, not so simple. The grama is completely mutar. But so he says that placing water in the fridge to become ice also is permitted. Again, he has question of nolad, and Ashkenazi may be a little bit more machmir, but according to Rav Ovadia, there is no lash when it comes to making jelly bazak. Okay, two final applications of the melachah of lash. Everything we've been talking about until now generally involves taking a solid and a liquid and mixing them together. What if you have two liquid or two solids, maybe? So the Shemirat Shabbat Kilchata talks over here. He says, everything is going to fuse into one mixture. It doesn't matter if I'm taking two, I've added a liquid, or I have a solid which has some liquid that is coming out of it, that is the natural moisture that's there. At the end of the day, the two substances are joining together. He says, even if I have two solid substances and there's no actual liquid there, Ela mitiv'am em nidbakim ze bazeh, but they stick together. If you're mixing honey and soft cheese together, or chem'ah b'avkat kakao, or butter and cocoa powder, all these cases, even though it's two solids, he says nonetheless you're mixing them together, and that would be lash. Okay, you can see over here Rav Moshe Feinstein questions the stringency, says not so clear, and the Orchot Shabbat as well. He says, Lechora yesh layin, ma ta'am le'sobah. He says, why should this be prohibited? Shalei, lo matzinu isur lisha, ela benotein mashke, o shal chomer medabek bekemach ubidvarim mufradim. Asher nasim nisa achat el dam mashke. Again, the point is, go back, what was our definition of lash? We said, well, you add a liquid to some different, right, to solid. I have, for example, kemach, flour. I have different granules of flour that are now all becoming stuck together. So I take two solids and mix them together. At the end of the day, the parts are not mixing together. So he says there that should not be a problem. Okay, finally we talk about our salads of Surah Shlishit. So one of them is the eggplant salad, which the Orchot Shabbat talks about, chatzilim, right, which is quite thick. He says that is considered a thick mixture, and therefore you should not make that on Shabbat. But it says if you made it before, and let's say the oil separates, rises to the top, or something like that, you want to mix it up a little bit more, that is fine. Okay, the vegetable salad, tuna and egg salad, again, so we spoke about this last week. We said if I have a vegetable salad, right, different pieces of vegetables, so long as they all remain distinct, there's no question of lash, even if there's oil and whatever. So source number 56 said it's permissible to mix a vegetable salad using oil, vinegar, and mayonnaise, right, the mayonnaise which you made before Shabbos, remember, so long as the pieces are large enough that they are recognized individually and not perceived as one body. When it comes to egg salad, tuna salad, okay, it's a little bit more complicated because there it's much smaller pieces and they really are going to coalesce together in one unit. So therefore he says, ideally you should make it before Shabbat, but if you're doing it on Shabbat, you could do it with dealing at the end of the day with a thinner mixture, and therefore a shinoi would be sufficient. Chopped eggs or tuna may be combined with mayonnaise in the usual order. However, it must be mixed with crisscross strokes. Mixing with a knife or the handle of utensils not permitted. Same odds true when adding egg or tuna when mixing vegetable bits into a completed salad. The new pieces may be mixed only in a crisscross fashion. Okay, I think I saw somewhere here. You have a look at footnote number 44. Right, what we said before. He said if we're dealing with a tuna salad and the like, where it's cut into larger, distinct pieces, that would seem to be okay. I'll just refer you once again. If you fast forward in the book to the end of the next year, we won't go through the whole thing now, but on page 199, we have this further Ian essay here about preparing egg salad on Shabbat. So we spoke, he goes through all the possible melachot that might come up. What about borer, when you are peeling the eggs? Right, talks about muktzah of the eggshells, mochek, right, some question, right, if you have the letters printed on the eggshells. Generally speaking, once the eggs have already been boiled, you wouldn't have the letters there anymore. Tochen, lash, right? So he's see over here, page 201. Says in order to avoid the problem of kneading, one should first pour the oil and mayonnaise into the bowl, and afterwards add the egg. Okay, that's the mixing should be done with a shinoi. That's what we discussed. Okay, so you can see the conclusion on page 202 if anybody is interested in that afterwards. From the above, we see the great caution needed when preparing egg salad on Shabbat and the fulfillment of a minhag Yisrael and the kavod Shabbat of being scrupulous about preparing and eating this food. Okay, come to Be'kres Tanasif, Surah Shlishit, your egg salad is already made for you and you can just eat it. All right, so that concludes our discussion of lash for the moment. We are now moving on to the fourth shir in the book. This is titled Halachot of preparing food on Shabbat. Again, we've been through borer, we've been through bishul, we've been through a number of the melachot. There's a few other bits and pieces and issues that come up that are raised in the poskim when it comes to preparing food on Shabbat. Again, we're not talking about cooking. We cannot cook on Shabbat. But, and this is an opportunity to look at some of the other melachot here and there that can come up. So the first one, and I think all we have time to go through today, is salting. Okay, adding salt to different types of foods, adding salt to water, adding salt to vegetable salads, etc. This is discussed in the poskim. Where do we find the melachah of salting. Okay, so until now, we've been discussing the 39 melachot that are involved in the most obvious ones that are involved when it comes to preparing food. It's Siddur the Pat. They would make the lechem panim for the Mishkan, for the Mikdash. So we went through from plowing and planting and harvesting the wheat and then sorting it and cooking the bread, etc. So we have other melachot as well. Some which are in terms of preparing the animal hides, which were used for the Mishkan. So one of those is salting and tanning. So it's interesting. The Mishnah talks about salting and tanning, right? Moleach and me'abed as two separate melachot. Why would you have to salt the hides? Essentially, once you've killed the animal and you've skinned the animal, those hides are going to decompose and they're going to rot very, very quickly unless they are preserved with salt, with large amounts of salting. And all these things are less familiar to us nowadays, but this is something which is very, very common. So the Mishnah lists salting and tanning as two separate melachot. The Gemara says, wait a minute, what are you talking about? They're actually the same thing. So it says, you're right. Those are two melachot. Have a look at source number 1. Again, we reset now the numbers. We're on page 159. 159 in the book. Source number 1. It said, Hamucho ve'me'abdo, which are listed as two separate melachot. Hainu moleach, hainu me'abed. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. They're the same thing. So Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish, says you're right, take out one of those. Those are actually counted as one of the 39 melachot. And there's another melacha of, it's translated here as drafting, of drawing lines on the hide to show where it should be cut, and that should replace. It's always interesting whenever the truth is we find this quite a lot by Hilchot Shabbat. The idea where you have two Amoraim, sometimes you have two Tanaim or two Amoraim who argue all the time. And Rava, right? Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish argue about everything throughout Shas. So if Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish both say the same thing, okay, that's a sign that there's something, right? Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, both of them said it. They argue about everything. Yeah, they don't argue. It must be true. So Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish said, right, these are actually one melacha, and this is replacement. So we have a melacha related to salting, relating to tanning, so that is relating to the hides. The question is that now same idea of salting going to apply to food? If I pour salt on food, okay, this is not, let's just say already, it's not, I'm sitting at Shabbos lunch or dinner, whatever, and I have some food on my plate and I add a little bit of salt. That's not what we're talking about. That's not going to be a problem. That is in no way resembling, maybe because of the way it's done, maybe because of the amount of salt, maybe because of the type of food, that is not going to resemble pouring a large amount of salt in order to preserve the hides. But if I have foods together where I pour a large amount of salt on, maybe pickling, something like that, is that going to be similar to this idea of salting, and could this be a prohibition? So this may come up. If I have vegetables, vegetable salads, etc., I want to add a large amount of salt in terms of dressing. That's a question that the poskim discuss. So the Gemara says like this: says Amar Rabba bar Avona, Hai man de malach bisra chayav mishum me'abed. He says somebody who salts meat on Shabbat, that is going to be chayav mishum me'abed. This is the melacha of tanning. So Rava Amar, so that was Rabba bar Avona. That's the first opinion. Rava Amar, Rava says, what are you talking about? Tanning is regarding to the hides. There is no me'abed when it comes to food. Amar Ashi, ve'afilu Rabba bar Avona lo amar ela dekabayle leorcha, aval lebeita lo mashvi inish mechleetz. So says Rav Ashi, now comes to explain the first opinion of Rabba bar Avona. He said, when he said salting, he means if you're adding the amount of salt, you're going on a journey and you need to preserve the meat, that's what I'm talking about. You're sitting at home and you're adding a little bit of salt, I'm not talking about that. Okay, so sitting at the meal and adding a bit of salt onto your plate, everybody would agree that's fine. So, but what we see here, we see two separate opinions in the Gemara. If I add a large amount of salt to the food, is that the melacha me'abed? Rav bar Avona says yes, that's the problem. He said chayav mishum me'abed, and Rava said no. He says there's no ibud when it comes to ochlin. It doesn't apply with food. Right. So you can see here just the summary. He says according to all views, salting food in preparation for consumption is permitted on Shabbat. I'm adding a little bit of salt right now to eat. That's fine. At least, certainly, Doraita. We're going to see the Rabbanan, there may be a difference. But the machloket is, we're talking about salting meat in order to preserve it for later. So says the Rambam, in source number 3, it says, Mafshit min ha'ol, kedei lasot kamei ha'chayav, v'chen ha'me'abed min ha'ol, kedei lasot kamei ha'chayav. You take a large portion of, you take the animal skin, you want to make a kameh, you want to make a sort of a bracelet from it, so you tan it, you add lots of salt in order to make it, to preserve it, that would be chayav. V'echad ha'me'abed v'echad ha'molech, shamlicha min ibudu, v'ein ibud ba'ochlin. That's the key phrase. Rambam quotes Rava from the Gemara, says any bud ba'ochlin, says this does not apply to food. Okay, if we just have the Rambam over here, open shut case, it's fine. But we don't just have the Rambam. We have other Rishonim who hold differently. The Piskei Arid, this is the Rid Rabbi Nishav Trani, he says the following. He says no. Kevan Rav Ashi mefalesh lemilte, since go back and look at see how did the Gemara work. We had the opinion of Rabbi Bar Avuna, who said that it's a problem. And then you had Rava who says, no, there's no Ibud B'Ochnin. And then what does the Gemara do? Then Rav Ashi comes along and says, no, I'm going to explain, I'm going to qualify exactly what Rabbi Bar Avuna said and what he meant. So says the Rid, if the Gemara went there and explained and clarified Rabbi Bar Avuna's opinion in the name of Rav Ashi, so clearly that means we paskanakim. We can deduce from this, from the melachah of the sugya, that is the halacha. Right? So he says, and again, it sounds like this would still be an isur d'oraita on a biblical level. If you're going to add a lot of salt to preserve the meat, then that would still be an isur d'oraita. Okay, so don't go around making biltong on Shabbat. Right? If you know what I'm talking about. Now, the Tosfot, source number 5, says, "Any bud ba'ochlin." He says, "Enatim mikam melichat ochlin dasur midrabanan melichat berg shmona shvatim." Says even according, says Tosfot. Now, even according to Rava, who said any bud ba'ochlin, he said no, there's no bud ba'ochlin on a d'oraita level. But midrabanan, we still have a problem. So essentially, we have here three opinions in the Rishonim how to view this. One opinion, one extreme says there is no problem of salting food. One opinion says, yes, there is a biblical opinion of salting food. Again, we're dealing with a lot. And one opinion in the middle says, there's no isur d'oraita, but there could still be an isur d'rabanan. Right, that's Tosfot. Where do we see this idea of this isur? So have a look here at source number 6. Here the Gemara gives us an example. We find a place where the Gemara does talk about salting food itself. It's going to be seemingly problematic. It says, Tani Rabbi Yehuda bar Chaviva, en mochin snon ubeitza b'Shabbat. He says you cannot salt a radish or an egg on Shabbat. Rav Chizkiya mishmei Rabbi amar snon asur ubeitza mutelet. Second opinion says no, radish is forbidden and egg is allowed. So Amar Rav Nachman me'rei shava melachna pugla. He says I would salt radishes on Shabbat. Amina if sudeka mafsidna lei, because he thought that ultimately you're salting them. It's not improving the taste. It's actually going to reduce the sharpness. It's going to therefore ruin the radishes. It's preserving it in a sense, but it's adding a negative quality, and therefore he thought it was allowed. It says, then I heard that in Eretz Israel they would salt the radishes all the time. So apparently it's not so bad. It's a good thing. So I don't do this anymore. He says I can still dip them in salt, but I cannot add a lot of salt. So again, what comes out of this Gemara seems to be that salting, and again, we're dealing with a large quantity of salt seemingly, but if that's going to improve the quality of the food, that may be forbidden. Says Rashi, Ein mochin sonon beitza, shalosh ve'arba chatichot yachad. So we see a couple of things here from Rashi. Again, the idea that this is about this improvement. What's the improvement? That you are hardening the food. So if you have a few pieces of radish together and I add a lot of salt, again, that is similar to this melachah of me'abed, and that would be a problem. Now the Rambam said, at least when it comes to the melachah of tanning, me'abed, he said there is no ibud when it comes to food. So how does he explain this Gemara? So you see in source number 8, on page 162. So mutalim lach beitza says I'm allowed to salt an egg, aval tznon, but a radish not. Chatzebasu neshenileh kekovesh kvashim b'Shabbat. V'akovesh asur mipnei shu kemivashim. Because this is similar to pickling. When you would pickle vegetables by adding a lot of salt, and that says the Rambam, you're doing something which is similar to pickling, that would be forbidden. Okay, so what we see when it comes to adding a lot of salt, there are those who say that it's similar to melachah, the melachah of me'abed, of tanning, and those who say, like the Rambam, that it's similar to pickling, and therefore, according to the Rambam, it seems first of all, it's only going to be foods that you would normally pickle. If it's a food that you wouldn't pickle, then that's why an egg, there's no problem of adding salt. So says the Shulchan Aruch, he paskins here like the Rambam. I cannot add salt if I have a radish. I have 4 or 5 pieces together. I'm going to add salt on. That looks like I'm pickling the food. That's similar to cooking. It's not actually cooking, but it's similar, and therefore it's going to be an isur. You can dip each piece by itself, and eat in that way. But eggs, I can add salt. Now the Mishnah Berurah says, that's what the Rambam said. Rashi gave a different explanation. He said, he said that by adding salt, the food is becoming harder, and this is going to cause a significant tikkun, a significant improvement, and it's similar to the melachah of tanning. So we have 2 different explanations, 2 different melachot. Basically, the way the Taz summarizes this whole sugya is as follows, and the Mishnah Berurah writes similarly. Have a look at source number 11. Taz says there are 2 different problems here, 2 different cases where this may come up. The trait when I'm dealing with the prohibition of salting, where would it apply? In one of the following 2 instances. He says, mitam shehu shoheh halbe kadei sheyatzeh melilutto achar sheyaziya kedarko. Right. One case is if I'm adding salt and I'm leaving, like when I pickle food, I'm leaving the vegetables in the salt for an extended period of time, then it's going to cause this more bitter taste. It's going to produce moisture that's going to come from the salt, right? He says there. So the point is, if I'm leaving it, it's a little bit confusing here because at first he writes Hushoya Halbe, and then after it says K'tzatzman. But I think he means to say that even if it's a small piece, but if I'm leaving it for a significant period of time in the salt, that's going to be a problem. Shenit. Alternatively, the second way, Mitam Shemolech Halbe Beyachad, is like what Rashi said, if I'm salting a lot together. So there, even if it's not for as long, the Az Afilo Eno Shoeh Asu Zegam Bazeh Domeh Leibud. So he says, what is this similarity to melech and me'abed? Either if I'm going to leave the food in the salt for a long time, or I'm going to take a very, very large quantity and add salt to that to make and even if it's not left for as long. So what we see from here is that there is a certain similarity to what the Rambam wrote, certain similarity to kvisha, to pickling vegetables, which is similar to cooking. It's not exactly the same as cooking, so it's not going to have all the same problems. So you remember when we spoke about cooking, we said even if I'm not cooking a pot, but I'm doing something that looks like cooking the pot, it resembles it very much, right? Putting it back on the fire. We had a whole series of shiurim exactly under what conditions and how and when that is prohibited. So would I say the same thing? Yeah, that I have pickled vegetables, right? Take some out. Can I put them back into the vinegar? So Rav Karelitz Chuchani says no. He says this is similar, but it's not the same. We don't find the same stringencies as we do by bishul itself. So he says, yeah, Yirakot kfushim b'toch chometz v'chadomeh. I have pickled vegetables inside vinegar and the like. Then kfushim kol tzokam, and they are fully pickled. Kshemotziam mitoch hakvisha mutar lachziam b'Shabbat. If I take them out, I'm allowed to put them back in. Ain't kavush achar kavush. No pickling after pickling, right? Bishul achar bishul. V'lo matzinu she'asur michzeh kekovesh. We don't find that we have a prohibition of something that appears like cooking. We don't find something that appears like pickling, which appears like cooking. No, we don't take it that far. In terms of which food items we're dealing with, so the Rambam wrote snon v'chadomeh, right? He said radishes and the like. So yes, says the Taz, says lav dafka tznon. This is not just radish, but any type of vegetable that we're going to be would usually be pickled. So he says like onions and garlic, etc. That would also be part of this. Okay, so that's the discussion. What exactly we're going to see a number of leniencies that come up, but I think that we'll stop there for today. Right, the next section we'll pick this up next time, which won't be next week. It'll be in 2 weeks' time. B'ezrat Hashem. Talking about preparing salt water on Shabbat. That's an interesting question. That's something which came up this year as well in terms of Leila Seder. Right, everybody remembers we have to make the salt water before Shabbat, right? Because you can't do it on Shabbat. Could you do it on Yom Tov? Maybe. We'll have to see how. Again, that's not going to be relevant in that way for another 20 years, so we don't have to worry about that. But some of the leniencies regarding preparing salt water will help us understand when and how we can add salt to the foods, and then we'll talk about salting salads and salting eggs, etc. And then we'll get into some of the other melachot that might be involved. I mentioned sovea, some of the other melachot that are involved in food preparation, machek, measuring, weighing food, etc. And once we finish that, so then we'll go into the next, the following topics of Hilchot Shabbat. Okay, so Adkan, thank you everybody for coming today. We'll see you not next week, but the following week. B'ezrat Hashem.